boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos à terceira sessão do ciclo de conferências Pensar, a pandemia, a Vida e o Cuidado, organizado pelo Instituto de Estudos Filosóficos. Vamos ter hoje connosco o professor Dr. Mark Coeckelbergh. Portanto, proceda à Fundação em inglês. Welcome to the third session, the conference cycle Thinking the Pandemic, Life and Care. Today focused on digital mediation. It is our pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Coeckelbergh, who is a full professor of philosophy of media and technology at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Vienna. He focuses on ethics in technology, in particular robotics and artificial intelligence. He is currently a member of various entities that support policy building in the area of robotics and artificial intelligence, such as the High-Level Expert Group on Artificial Intelligence, which advises the European Commission and the Austrian Robotics Council, as well as the Austrian Advisory Council on Automating Mobility, the Foundation for Responsible Robotics, and the IEEE Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations in AI. He is also the former president of the Society for Philosophy and Technology, author of 14 philosophy books, and has been involved in interdisciplinary collaborations in the context of the European research projects Perseu, Inbots, Dream, and Satori. Welcome.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. I'm speaking to you from a very warm, hot Vienna. We have 32 degrees, which is often like this in summer here, but it's quite a change from before. I'm happy to be here and to contribute to thinking about the pandemic, which of course has occupied us for a long time already, and is still occupying our thoughts, and we think about the future, also how this is going to be this summer, the next academic year, and so on. And let me share the presentation. It's easier to give you an overview what I am going to do. So I will do this, and I hope that when I start the presentation that you can see the presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I decided to talk about vulnerability, technology, and power. Basically ask some existential and political questions concerning COVID-19 pandemic and technology. I do this from a background of philosophy of technology that is itself influenced by various philosophical traditions, including post-phenomenology, pragmatism, and critical theory. I also am interested in ethics and political philosophy, and I'm more and more working now on the political philosophy of AI, as I call it. And you will see the results of that in the winter. I'm also doing, as your introduction says, policy advice, and also interdisciplinary work with technical people, people from legal backgrounds, people from international organizations, and so on. So let me ask some existential and political questions, and it's a kind of map of questions, map of issues, which I will analyze also partly by drawing on existing work, partly by further developing questions that connect to artificial intelligence today, and how artificial intelligence is connected in various ways with the questions regarding the pandemic. So let me start with existential questions, and the starting point there for me is my book Human Being and Risk, where I was thinking about human vulnerability and how human vulnerability gets transformed in a technological era. So first, it's very clear that human beings are vulnerable and mortal also, and the pandemic has made this abundantly clear. So it reminds us of our mortality, of our vulnerability to disease also, which is a theme that has been interesting to philosophers and artists also in the course of our of the history of our culture. Often philosophers have framed their philosophy in response to what happened around them in the world, and this is one example. The earthquake of Lisbon in the 18th century, which is of course yeah, very well known to you, and which has sparked people such as Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers to ask the question, you know, why could this happen, and why would a God allow this to happen? So philosophers have responded to disasters, to problems before that. It also becomes clear that of course artists have done that too. And for example, Shakespeare in his time, he responded also to the plague, to what in the languages that I know is called pest in that time. So we always respond to things that happen and things that threaten our vulnerability, and we do that also through art and philosophy. But the main means to really do something about what happens around us and to do something about what nature does to us is technology. And so one could say that the struggle against vulnerability, not accepting vulnerability, probably sometimes also not accepting mortality, is something that's very human, and that means also that technology as an anti-vulnerability tool, as something we use to fight against vulnerability, is also something that's very human. So technology as anti-vulnerability tool belongs to what we are as humans and how we do things. Some strands in our culture even want you know, not only to reduce vulnerability, but also to eradicate it, to eradicate mortality. Also, transhumanism is an example of that. And here is an example of a story by Nick Bostrom, who says, like, well, you know, there's this disease in the world, and people die. This could be symbolized by a dragon tyrant who tyrannizes us. And we should fight against that rather than accept what comes from nature or what was used to be called the will of God. So technology belongs again to this fight against vulnerability. Here it would be technology that changes humans genetically so they live longer. And some transhumanists do not want us to die and try to think about techniques such as uploading the mind digitally in order to avoid biological death. But also, without these extreme views, it's clear that we use technology to reduce vulnerability, and luckily so. We have saved a lot of child deaths, for example, in the last 100, 200 years. By means of modern science. This is, of course, something to be welcomed. However, all these technologies as ways of reducing vulnerability in turn also create new vulnerabilities. Think about antibiotics that then makes people resistant against them, and again they are vulnerable to disease. In the case of the current pandemic, think about vaccination, which is very good, which reduces the risk of death, for example, but at the same time has also side effects. So our technologies, medicines, technological and scientific means to deal with human vulnerability and mortality always creates also new forms. One could say that it transforms our vulnerability, and as I call it, it transforms being at risk. I will come back to that. So if we look in the pandemic, what kind of knowledge we have of the risks associated with the COVID-19 virus and its variants, we have two kinds of knowledge. One is so-called objective knowledge, which is given by us by science and technologies. So here we have a role of data and statistics in the pandemic. And this gives us this knowledge of COVID-19 as a statistical phenomenon. On the other hand, however, I also have my own subjective experience of the risk. Yeah, so I might fear that I die, or I might see someone that I know or that is famous that gets sick, and therefore I fear that. This has nothing to do with the numbers as such or with the statistics, but it has to do with the way I, as a human subject, experience the pandemic. And so both kinds of knowledge together shape what it means to be at risk in the pandemic. And so with my term being at risk, I try to get to this non-dualistic understanding of risk, where risk is always objective and subject at the same time. It is indeed directed towards something, and objective in the sense that we can have this statistical knowledge that artificial intelligence, for example, gives us, that data analysis gives us. But at the same time, there's no such thing as a risk in itself. I always interpret risk. I always talk about risks. I have feelings about risk. And this has to do with me as a subject. So one could say that we are vulnerable, we are open to the world. There's phenomenologically speaking, an intentionality towards the risk, but that openness also renders us vulnerable. And through what we do, we render ourselves vulnerable. So for example, if I go in a mass of people in the city, then I render myself vulnerable to COVID-19. I take a risk. So risk is not just something that happens to us from the outside, but also has to do with my experience of the risk on the one hand, and on the other hand, with what I do, how I actively relate with the world, how I engage with my environment, how I engage with others, and in that I make choices. I have agency. I can decide not to shake hands with someone. I can decide to nevertheless hug someone, and so on. So this risk is not only something that is outside, external to my actions and experience. It is part of me, and so the term vulnerability, I think, stresses this, and the being at risk, which is a term that uses a similar language than Martin Heidegger used when he talked about being in the world. So what I want to say with that is that there is this phenomenology and existential phenomenology of being at risk. I am at risk as a person that is deeply connected to the world, and therefore is also vulnerable and mortal. And in Heidegger we can see this also these different modes of knowledge that I talked about, which I think can very much illuminate how we talk about risk and how we can talk about risk. So Heidegger says the publicness of everyday being with one another knows that as a constantly occurring event, as a case of that. Someone or another dies, be it a neighbor or a stranger, and people unknown to us die daily and hourly. That is encountered as a familiar event occurring within the world, and one also dies at the end, but for now one is not involved. So this is a mode of what Heidegger calls inauthentic being, and inauthentic attitude towards death, because it, in its everydayness, it denies that there is something like that, or at least it is only a death that happens to one, to others. So this connects with this more objective knowledge. There are the statistics. We know that people die of COVID-19, but that doesn't mean that we fully realize this in the light of the possibility and the certainty of our own death. Yeah, so if we want to know it, we know that we for sure will die at some point, but we choose not to face that. And we choose also not to face directly this this danger of our own death. So when we say that one dies from COVID-19. So this connects, as I said, to this objective knowledge versus subjective, the data about the pandemic versus my own experience. And when it comes to my experience, we can also further develop that by using Heidegger, who talks about fear and angst and Sorge, care. So let's look at that in more detail to further understand what does it mean to fear in the pandemic. So when we are at risk in a pandemic, we are, like all human beings, always ahead of ourselves, in a sense that we can look to the future and we imagine what could happen in the future. And in the end, we are able, in principle, to also face and consider that as the ultimate possibility. This gives us then angst, a special kind of existential fear, but it's also a chance for Heideggerian authenticity. So if we connect our experience in the pandemic with realizing that we are vulnerable, that we are going to die, we are in Heideggerian sense authentic. Also, with regard to fear, we can find in Heidegger an interesting phenomenological description of what this means. So he says there's the threat that something can get us, let's say the virus. There is a threat, but it's not sure that this will happen. It may happen, it may not happen. It could be that the danger passes by. And this is also there with the COVID-19 virus. It could catch us, but it also could not. And so we have this uncertainty. There is a threat, and this gives us fear. And if what threatens us is unknown, if we don't know what is coming to us, then Heidegger says this becomes horror. And if it comes nearer, if we feel that we are more at risk, one could say, then it becomes terror. We are terrified by the possibility that COVID-19 will get us. Now, according to Heidegger, fear is part of being in the world. We are in the world in a fearsome way. By itself, that is nothing special. But of course, there are always new objects of fear. There are new threats, new dangers. And the way we respond to that, I said, is through choices and action, but also through what Heidegger calls Sorge in German, which means care and concern. Because we are concerned, right? In the pandemic, we are all concerned about what might happen to me, to you, to all kinds of people. And we also might translate our concern into care, in the sense that we do not only care about what happens to me and others, but we also might take action actually to protect people. And yeah, as I said, in a pandemic we have this fear, and we can translate this into care rather than just only fear. If we want, for example, we can help a stranger. But at the same time, when we try to, via care, via technologies also, to reduce our vulnerability and to lessen the fear, at the same time, new risks come up. I mentioned already vaccination. So this is a problem that we have. So every time that we invent new technologies, that we invent new medicines, that science progresses, luckily, we also, through that very methods and through those very technologies, create new problems and new risks for ourselves. Finally, then, to close this part about more existential issues, we also can take the opportunity during the pandemic not only to care for others, but also to care for ourselves. And what that means can be developed by using Foucault's work, who at the end of his life talked about technologies of the self. And technologies of the self are operations on our body that we do to control ourselves, for example, to discipline ourselves, but also to transform ourselves. At that time, Foucault was in the US and was influenced in California to this culture, a hippie culture, where people try to transform themselves. Well, today in the pandemic, people have used the time, first of all, to reduce their own vulnerability and feeling of vulnerability. So they have taken self-care actions which were physical. For example, I went running, right? But also they've taken care of mental health challenges that have to do with the isolation during the winter, during the worst time of the pandemic. So keeping yourself mentally healthy, cope with isolation, increase resilience can be seen as forms of self-care, where we operate on our minds and bodies to transform ourselves. And one could say that in the pandemic, this has increased a lot. But it's also an opportunity. It's something that we had to do, but also an opportunity. And this also has a political dimension then, because is it just me who decides this, that I should work on myself, or do we live in a culture where maybe other people also put pressure on us to change, to transform ourselves, to improve ourselves? And this leads me to the second part of my presentation, which concerns the political questions that I want to ask about the pandemic and about the role of artificial intelligence. So political questions is something that I started to look at when I was invited to comment on the COVID-19 crisis. And when I started to look at these different kinds of knowledge that are created and produced during the pandemic. And there are various political questions one can ask that are more about politics in a narrow sense. For example, we can talk about the policies of digitalization. Suddenly, digitalization was something that we had to do also in universities that previously were less digitalized. And in the end, it was digitize or die, I call it in the article, in the sense that doing this also really increased the chances of survival, reduced vulnerability to COVID-19. So in that sense, digitalization was a good thing. Also, it provides us the opportunity to think about distinctions such as online and offline. Our lives became much more online, and to such an extent that one could ask how useful is this distinction still, given that our lives are anyway, with or without pandemic, but especially in the pandemic, that our lives are anyway totally happening at the border between the two. For example, now I'm giving this talk, I'm using an online medium, but at the same time, you still have bodies, I still have a body, I still move in space. They're in various ways. I'm very real and very offline as well. So this distinction is very problematic, I think, and is now even more problematic. But let us now focus on some political questions that I think definitely need to be asked. Some have to do with knowledge again, what I call political epistemology here, and some have to do with the values and principles that we hold important in political philosophy, such as freedom, justice, equality, and democracy, and which could be under threat in a pandemic, and through the ways we deal with the pandemic by using digital technologies and AI. So if we look at the political epistemology, then I argued that we shouldn't just ask, like, what is this thing called COVID-19? What is something? But we should also ask, like, what makes possible my experience and knowledge of the risks, and what is the role in technology in producing those knowledge? What kind of technologies are involved here? And this kind of question, where we move away from is questions to more questions about what kind of knowledge regimes are produced, is something that's definitely inspired by Michel Foucault's work, who is often used to talk about power in a more fine-grained way than just power in the sense of legitimation of the state, which is a traditional topic in political philosophy. So if we look at Foucault's concepts, we can find a few interesting ones that I think really can help us to think about the pandemic and think about technology in the pandemic. The first concept there is biopolitics. So Foucault says the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power, or in other words, how, starting from the 18th century, modern Western societies took on board the fundamental biological fact that human beings are a species. This is what I've called biopower. So biopower is all about life and politics that gets entangled. And interestingly, Foucault himself, to show this biopolitics in operation, and also to link with disciplining and other themes that he wrote about, actually Foucault gives examples from the history of epidemiology. So things like leprosy, plague, and smallpox, you know, one could easily add COVID-19 here. It's very interesting that we can bridge here between Foucault's history of those epidemics and the way people dealt with on the one hand, and our current ways of dealing with things. For example, in the history of madness, Foucault says that the history of leprosy shows how power separates healthy from sick, and how it was used to exclude. First, the leprous people were excluded and put in hospitals. And later, these infirmaries were used for other people who society wanted to include: the sick, but also the mad, the vagabonds, people who were considered as not fit for society. So here, interestingly, infrastructures and technologies become tools of separation and exclusion. A second kind of use of biopolitics, or mode of biopolitics, happened during the plague. So now we're later, the early modern times, 17th century, where Foucault describes the birth of discipline and surveillance as techniques that society uses here. The idea is not just to separate, but also to control people. And then a third stage, which he illustrates by smallpox, talking about smallpox in his lectures for the Collège de France. He talks about statistical analysis. And this, of course, can all be reflected upon in the light of the current pandemic, because all these modes of power, as Saracen calls it, also come together in the current pandemic. So we see that these old ways of doing things, these old knowledge regimes and disciplinary regimes that are connected to dealing with epidemics and pandemics are still used today. For example, the separation of people. Quarantine was something that many scholars only knew from history books, from Foucault also, but we have now experience of quarantine ourselves. Then discipline and punishment. Think about surveillance on the streets by means of cameras or police people. Also the way we are now treated as borders, which is even worse from the perspective of freedom. I will come back to that. Than before, much worse than before. Then analyzing the development of the pandemic by means of big data is of course also an example again of statistics, but it's statistics on steroids, or rather statistics on AI. So now data science is used to analyze the statistics. But these very modes of disciplining and these models of power that Foucault describes, models of biopower, are still here today. So artificial intelligence and data science are basically used as means to manage and control the population and the bodies of people, and this enables, one could say, new forms of biopower by the use of old methods combined with new ones, with artificial intelligence. So more examples of this: for example, drones have been used with loudspeakers to make people observe social distancing. This is in itself not necessarily done by AI, but the data that are used could come from AI. Then drones that analyze and collect biometrical data such as body temperature and heart rate have been used in the US, for example, and AI has been used to monitor people if they follow the quarantine protocols in Russia. So here, it's not just AI, but it's a set of technologies that are used for this purpose, and AI is part of that. And AI continues that tradition of a statistical, objective kind of knowledge that's produced about people, and then in the second instance used in a biopolitical way to control people, to exercise power over people and their bodies. Now, if we look at these issues, which we've now analyzed by using Foucault's concept of biopower, if we relate that to more standard Anglophone political philosophy, then we see that this can also be seen as threatening some of our basic principles, political principles. For example, Isaiah Berlin already wrote about the importance of having negative freedom, that no one interferes with you, and also about the freedom as autonomy, that you want to be the master of your own life. But of course, if privacy is violated, if power intervenes in the bodily autonomy of people, if I cannot decide, for example, which vaccine that gets into my body, and if in the end the state of emergency becomes a new normal. You can see that in the work of Agamben already in 2005, and also more recent publications in Italian, where he rightly worries that the state of emergency becomes a new normal, and we could worry about that today again when we are living through the pandemic. One could also talk about positive freedom. I will not go into this, but one could also say that positive freedom is threatened here in the form of human flourishing that's made impossible by means of all these biopolitical measures. And then, of course, one of the topics that I didn't say so much about yet, that's also offered by Foucault, is surveillance and the specific ways of surveillance that have been used. I talked about surveillance and disciplining, but here we see that a specific kinds of surveillance is used and a specific kind of discipline, namely a surveillance that leads to self-disciplining. One way to understand that is to look at how prisons prisoners were put under surveillance under the so-called panopticon, which is described by Foucault, which has been invented by Bentham in the 18th century. The idea was that instead of directly controlling people, you put people, you order the prison cells in such a way that prisoners have the feeling that they could be seen by the guards, but they cannot see the guards themselves. So basically, they will behave good because they know that they could be seen. And this kind of surveillance is also used in the pandemic. I put on my mask because I could be seen by a police person in a specific public space. So this is a threatening of people. It's in a way, if you want, putting people at risk in order to discipline them, and this disciplining them is itself an anti-vulnerability strategy in the pandemic. Then there, next to freedom and surveillance, there are also questions about global justice. For example, I mean, not only at national level, but also in the world in general. There's a huge impact on labor markets. There's racism, othering and blaming. For example, Chinese people in the US were blamed for the pandemic. And in the end, this biopolitics is also a matter of life and death. It's not only here, we shouldn't only care about justice here just for the sake only of reducing bias. We should also care for it because it saves lives. And then there's intergenerational justice also, right? So if young people have to undergo certain measures in order to save older people, there's a sort of thinking about justice behind that. And I'm not saying that thinking is wrong, but it's a thinking that at least we should critically and openly discuss, which is not done today. So questions about justice and solidarity between different generations also. Some of these problems can be put in the language of equality also rather than justice. For example, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of United Nations, said in 2020, and now was published in 2021 on the website also of the UN, said that the virus is shining a spotlight on inequalities of all kinds and poses a risk to the health of the most vulnerable. So instead of having an equal distribution of risk, we have those who anyway were already vulnerable, who were least able to cope, impacted most. And that means that more people will get pushed into extreme poverty, famines, and so on. And so this is especially a problem in countries where the government has not acted on time, and where there are lots of deaths, but also where next to people dying, there's also just lots of poverty and increase of already existing vulnerabilities. So to conclude this part, interestingly, the virus has this role here of bringing up societal problems that are already there. It also shows very clearly that there are already ways of disciplining in society. There are already old methods from early times already, methods like quarantining, methods like disciplining people by putting them under a panopticon surveillance. All this exists already, statistical analysis. And I find it interesting that, as a philosopher of technology, that technology plays such an important role in this. We have these biopolitical technologies that do all this. Now, these are all kind of issues, and one could question, like, what about solutions? Now, this is a big question, of course, how to increase the freedom of people, how to increase more equality and justice, how to respect people's autonomy and dignity. But I think one issue is definitely that in a global world where we have indeed this pandemic, this epidemic that's everywhere, that's really a global planetary phenomenon, I think it's important to also have the political instruments, the political technologies, I would call them, to tackle these problems. And currently, unfortunately, we have a lot of nationalism. Countries have rather retreated and tried to deal with things in their way, rather than cooperating a lot, rather than also working at a supranational level. And I've argued in an opinion article why I think that this is the wrong way to go, and why I think that global governance should be a better way to do that. Global governance, which doesn't necessarily mean that you need a world government, but you need a strong enough supranational institution, which we currently don't have. The UN is not that much mandated as supranationalists would want to. Also, some people argue, yeah, but it's not democratic. Well, it can be democratic or it cannot be democratic, but this problem we also have at the level of the nation state. And finally, I think, in spite of all the cultural differences, I think we have a lot of possibilities to find common ground around the concept of human rights, for example, but also around the very biopolitical effects that we see, that the people have the same needs, and to some extent the same bodies also. Of course, one should take into account that bodies differ, that cultures differ, and there can be no standard recipe for everything and all, but you can have some common principles and some common strategies, I think, and agree on that. So this, of course, ties into philosophical issues around universalism and particularism, and also sensitive issues like should we go for identity politics with regard to justice, or have more universalist politics. I think there's definitely an urgency to tackle these questions, and so we need to do that. Similar things could be said about climate change and other global problems. Then secondly, I would like to point out that when we are thinking about all these issues, we're thinking not just about culture, but also about nature, not just about technology, but also about society, not just about science, but also about the ways we experience a pandemic. And so if Foucault started to bring life into politics, mixing categories that were normally in modernity separate, I think we should do the same for politics and technology. And one inspiration here for me is Bruno Latour's work, especially We Have Never Been Modern, but also environmental philosophy and post-humanism. So I think we could further do more work on this and further try to conceptualize in what ways life and culture mix in this problem. Then finally, we are in what some people call the Anthropocene, right? So humans have a lot of control over this planet. Nevertheless, ironically, we feel very helpless. This is often not remarked, but in spite of the fact that we have become this geological force, we also have a feeling that we lose control. And in the pandemic, that feeling became more. Now, the question is, should our answer always be more control, or could we also think of other ways of dealing with nature and technology? Can we also let go? And here Heidegger is my inspiration, especially his concept of Gelassenheit, but I will not further go into that. I just hope to have offered at the end of this talk some potential avenues for more work. Given the time, I will close here. So I conclude that human vulnerability is being transformed in the pandemic by technologies and biological agents such as viruses. This pandemic, if we look at this from a more non-modern point of view, is neither natural, completely natural, nor completely under our control. But what we can say is that what we know about virus and its risks is definitely not only something objective, but also personal, existential, and true political, since it creates these problems that I talked about, and since this biopolitics is in operation. I find it also interesting that there are some normative views behind this analysis. For example, the view that the knowledge should not be colonized by only the statistical knowledge, but that there should be room for personal experience, and that also people still care about political values, and we should still care about political values such as freedom and justice. And so in the pandemic, this, one could have the normative view that this exceptional situation shouldn't be continued and normalized. And then finally, I think the pandemic reminds us about our own existential vulnerability as humanity, but also personally. We will die sooner or later, and we philosophically and otherwise, psychologically, existentially have to cope with that somehow. This makes us concerned and care. And the pandemic also has created biopolitical opportunities, which I think we should definitely critically evaluate by means of the concepts of political epistemology and concepts such as freedom, justice, and equality. So the instruments, conceptual instruments that I proposed in this talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Coeckelbergh, for your interesting analysis on the different challenges posed by the recent development of digital technology. I will now open the floor to questions or comments, either by the spectators that are physically present or by those that are following the conference online. So would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? I can start by asking a rather prosaic question regarding the political and economic implications of the latest research related to the pandemic. So I'm thinking not just about the production of vaccines, but the use of online learning platforms, the use of surveillance drones, which you've mentioned, the use of big data, and so on. So as you know, most of the investment on these new technologies is being funded by private corporations or through public-private partnerships. And so my question is, in the absence of direct public investment on these technologies, isn't there a risk that they will increasingly elude public control and scrutiny and end up working against, or at least independently, from a democratic or collective conception of the common good?
Very good question, and I very much agree with the normative direction this is going into. I think it's definitely a problem when we, not only outsource these activities only to private companies, but then also in a way become dependent on them, and so that relates, of course, to the general way that that we allow power to be distributed. The way we also allow the common good to be decided by these powerful corporate actors, and that we allow this intransparency to persist, which definitely shows a democratic deficit. So I mean, here I focused on Foucault's analysis, which is a lot about what I would call horizontal power, about how power is more always there in society and used in disciplining practices, which include the way we ourselves discipline. And so he wanted to get away from the Marxist view of power mainly where power is about the state exercising power and about a socioeconomic system, capitalism. But I think we should not disregard that too. I think it can also be a tool to analyze the situation. And I think we need both kinds of analysis to make sure that we also see those kind of power imbalances and threats to democracy.
So you don't think that the two analyses or the two lines of criticism are mutually exclusive?
That's right. I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think they both can and should be used because they analyze the problems at different levels and show to different ways in which power is exercised. And I think it's even through combining them that we can also see some of the new dangers that there are. For example, when surveillance technology is basically used by the state, but also bought from companies who then, through the design of the technology, basically decide how surveillance is done in the name of public good, in the name of democracy. So I think by having the both concepts, we can point to this kind of tensions. And this is definitely something that could be further developed and was not so present in the current presentation.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes. Coeckelbergh would like to ask a question. Just trying to connect again. Is it?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Coeckelbergh. I appreciate it a lot. Do you see any existential tension between the extreme feeling of control aroused by our technological device and the feeling out of control caused by the current pandemic? And if you agree with this kind of tension, don't you think that this tension will affect the very feeling of vulnerability and care?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for your question. Yes, I agree it would affect. So we already have the feeling that we lack control due to our incomplete control of natural forces. So we use technologies, but it's always incomplete. But now I would say that ironically in modernity and now when the technologies get more globalized, the more control that it gives you, at the same time we feel as individuals, we feel out of control. We feel that we are just part of the bigger system. This was already in modernity criticism, but today it's even more. So the humanity as a whole gets more agency. It seems, but as an individual, we feel that we lack individual control over our lives. So we feel that we are in the hands of the scientists, in the hands of the companies that develop vaccines, in the hands of the police, and so on. And I think existentially that can be very damaging if we have this feeling of serious control. And psychologically, it probably leads to pathologies in our society.
But,
depression, anxiety, and so on.
But you don't think that this tension restore our with the pandemics restores our social feeling, the way we are with ourselves and with others, do you think that because the care relations depend on this kind of relationships and proximity and if you don't have this kind of proximity, you don't know if you are allowed to do your best or to help such people and even those who are in the vulnerability situation before the pandemics. I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, it's strange because it's the way the pandemic has played out in terms of quarantine and so on. It's on the one hand, it separates people from each other, it isolates. On the other hand, there is a feeling of solidarity because we're all in it. I just have the sense that that politically, instead of using this to enhance solidarity among people, the methods used by governments to deal with the pandemic are more directed towards isolation. So I think it's a missed opportunity because with the feeling of solidarity, we could create relationships between people that are more careful, full of care, and we could stimulate the care that people have for one another. So I think it's a missed opportunity, and I think in the existential literature there is too much emphasis already in Kierkegaard and Heidegger on the individual and the individual angst, and less on the solidarity and less on the care, in the sense not just concern that I have, a worry, but the care that goes to the other and is about the other. I think that's missing, and that's of course much more there in contemporary philosophy of care, and also in pragmatist philosophy that is about solidarity or post-Marxist thinking. So I think we need there some theoretical input to think further about this active care and this relation to the other, rather than only the isolation and the existential problems of the individual.
But in the same way, I think this the problem, like I see it, means that digital mediation serves at this moment like a kind of glue to join people at distance. But relations we have are communication relations, not perception relations. You are not face to face. You can communicate using, for instance, such platforms like Zoom.
Like now,
but are not face-to-face relations, and you need to communicate if you are good or are bad, if you need something. So care relations, I think, depend on these these small perceptions you can have in the presence of others. So you cannot transform care relations in the medical relationship. You have a disease, for instance, and you need a medicine. You need a doctor, and you tell, "What are you suffering? I have this problem." Care relations, I think, normal care relations are quite different, because sometimes it's your friend that tell you that you need to change your life, that support you because you are sad, and you don't communicate them what you are feeling, what is wrong with you. They observe you, and they give this feedback.
Yes, interesting. Yeah, so I think the way I look at it is that from the philosophy of media and technology side, we have always already been discussing what is the difference between in-person and mediated by technologies like screens. And of course we sense that there is a difference, but it was not so easy to say what it is. And I think now during the pandemic gives us an opportunity to further think about that. And for me, I would say that the idea of the presence of someone that is the embodied presence is really a difference. Like now, it's very different to talk to you like this in comparison of being in the same room as embodied people. So as you said, there's non-verbal cues, but also we can really recognize the other as a person and so on. If we're in the same room, and now this is we try to do it, but it doesn't completely work. There is something that we lack, and I think care can be expressed remotely, but it cannot be fully actualized or something. I can say on WhatsApp, for example, I care for you, but I cannot really be there in the presence. I cannot do something. I cannot really interact in the embodied way, and so that makes. I think that's very interesting, and we could philosophically develop that. What is it exactly that's the difference? And I think if I would, want to endorse or develop an more existential approach, it would have to be one that starts from the social existence. We human beings as embodied and social beings. And I think that was the mistake in the past of the more individualistic existentialists. They first thought about the individual, and then they had to somehow add the social at the end. And in a way, one should start with the social.
Yeah.
And so that's still, I think, there's a lot of work to do here on social phenomenology, social existential existentialism.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, so I'd like to thank Professor Coeckelbergh very much for his presentation, for taking the time to discussing his views with us. I thank everyone that followed the conference for your presence, and I hope to see you all in the next session of our conference cycle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing this and for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Likewise.